And you don't seem to understand. A shame you seemed an honest man. And all the fears you hold so dear will turn to whisper in your ear. And you know what they say when I hurt you. And you know that it means so much. And you don't leave them choose nothing.
Reginald here. It is with great joy that I get to bring you my review of Darktide. I've spent a lot of time on it, so I really hope you enjoy it. I'll be breaking this review into two parts. The first part will be a short section on whether or not you, as a person not playing Darktide already, should purchase Darktide right now. The second part will be for players already playing Darktide, or for those who are just curious. I'll be breaking down the current state of the game, and I'll be looking at it as a product manager looks at and analyzes a product, and try to break down what Fatshark could do to improve the product and increase customer satisfaction and ultimately increase their revenue. So we'll be diving into that as well. So stick around if you want the longer part, but let's go into the short part now. So the question is, should you buy Darktide? And the answer is yes, but you will not be getting the game that Fatshark is advertising. So what are you getting? And will you get your money's worth? Let's tackle the first question first. What you get with Darktide is a super fun horde shooter that is great to play with buddies and friends. It has the best of any game out in the market in terms of close combat mixed with ranged combat in that kind of setting and environment. It feels slick and fun to play. You will certainly have some fun with the 4 different classes. It certainly adds some variety to this kind of gameplay that you don't get in a game like Left 4 Dead, where everybody's just a carbon copy with a little bit of different voice lines. And so I think those are really fun and excellent elements to the game that make it worth your time. You also gain access to one of the best interpretations of the 40K environment into a video game. The spaces are incredible and really stylish, and it really comes over well. The music is fantastic. The gameplay controls feel tight and fun. The characters are there, and in my opinion, many of the characterizations through the voice packs are excellent. The weapons are there. All the iconic weapons are there. So if you like 40K, you're gonna get a lot of that out of this, especially if you liked the Dark Heresy role-playing games, which I certainly did. And you're going to get a really fun time when you actually get into each mission, which is where the game shines. And of course, that is the actual game, so that's what you're hoping for, right? And yeah, I mean, you're just going to have a really great time playing this for between, 40 and 100 hours. And that's when you're going to run into a huge frustration point. I'm going to delve much deeper into those frustration points that I mentioned in the second part of this video. So if you want to watch about that, you can stick around. But for a new player who's looking for a really fun experience as a co-op game with a couple buddies for 40 to 100 hours, I'm confident you're going to get your money's worth. This is a $40 game. Don't buy the extra $20, cosmetics pack. You don't need it. You don't want it. And you'll get $40 worth of value out of this game. It'll be a fun time. And, as long as you are expecting to only play about 40 to 100 hours and then kind of put it down when it hits that frustration point, great, you're going to be having a good time. But I mentioned earlier that Fatshark was advertising something different out of this game than what I told you it contains. And maybe you're looking for that, and that's why you're looking at Darktide. And if that's the case, you're not going to want to buy Darktide. You see, what Fatshark says this game is a live service with regular content updates that's meant to allow you to keep coming back to the game over and over and over a long period of time. Which is really cool. You know, I was certainly excited about that. Kind of like Warframe, where there's regular content additions, the content is meaningful, and it keeps the game fresh so you can keep coming back and kind of make it maybe something like a hobby, right? Where you go play Darktide for a couple hours every night, or an hour every night, or maybe 30 minutes every night, or whatever. Just something you can go do with your bros once a week, or something you can do regularly, and that stays fresh as you go along. That's what you're looking for. You want something where the game satisfies that interest in keeping you busy over many hundreds of hours, right? And in exchange for that, you're thinking, well, you know, you'll chip in a little bit of money here and there. Maybe you'll buy some cosmetics because the game will be around for a while, and you don't mind looking cool while you're playing video games, and you've got a little extra cash in your pocket, so what the heck, why not, right? But you see, that's not what Darktide is. That's not what Darktide can be, at least not anytime soon, because what Darktide actually is on maintenance, trying desperately to complete itself to the standard they were expecting to release it at for the last 6 months, while also trying to put out the Xbox version of the game. And that means that you won't be getting significant, meaningful content updates anytime over the next, I don't know, another 6 months probably. Fatshark has proven to be both slow and reticent to make the changes necessary to at least keep the game alive. So what you have ended up with is a lot less than was desired and advertised, and a time scale that is not clear and certainly not likely to achieve anything that you want to invest your time in to this degree. Not only that, but Fatshark has proven completely unwilling to address, 5 months of direct player and community feedback on things that are high friction for the player, things that cause a lot of frustration. So you're going to get to a point, for sure, where you have played the game, you really like the game, it's fun, you want to keep playing, but every time you get out of that mission, there is something annoying you. Whether that's you wanted to go craft a new weapon, but you can't because the RNG system is gating you to death, or you wanted to play the same mission again because you were having fun and you happened to lose, but it's not on the board, so you can't queue it up again. Whatever it is, there will be some complex of things that absolutely annoy you to death that will make you want to stop playing. And it made most of the people that I know, and most of the people I know on the internet, stop playing the game after 40 to 100 hours because they're just like, this just isn't worth it. I want to play more, but the systems are so frustrating that I would rather just not play. I'll go do something else instead. And, that's why I'm saying, sure, if you're going to play 40 to 100 hours and think you're getting your money's value on a time basis, like that's true, and you're going to have a great time, but there's going to be a point where you hit where you wish you could keep playing the game, but you just don't want to anymore. So if you're that kind of person looking for a long-term sort of entertainment, then consider checking back in 6 months. But if you know that you're just looking for something you can play for a little while and then drop, then you're going to be happy. So go ahead and buy it. And I don't want to come across as too negative here. I mean, one thing is very clear. The core team that is actually building the game part of the game is extremely dedicated to their work, and it really is reaching the level of masterpiece in terms of its execution. The gameplay, I mean. Not the bugs either, but you get what I mean. The problem is all the systems that surround it are tremendously bad, and they haven't been changed in a timely manner. And they need to be changed because if they are changed, this game can actually make more money. Players will stick around in larger volumes and spend more on the product. And so that's why you've seen a couple of videos of mine, potentially, that are complaining about those deep difficulties. Because ultimately, I believe that this product is almost the best product in this genre ever made. Almost. All right, hooray, we did it. We explained whether or not you should buy this game, and we did it quickly enough that you can, take back some of your life and, go do something with it. But if you want to stick around, I'm going to discuss at length all of the issues in Darktide, the current state of the game, and what we can do, what Fatshark can do to make this game better, both in the short and the long term, because, I'm a product person, and that's my favorite hobby, is fixing disasters, actually. It's what I do for a living. This section is certain to get a bit long, and it's probably going to be a bit dry for people who aren't into this kind of thing. So if it's not your jam, I have timestamped this video. Just skip to a section that you like or seems interesting. I won't take offense, and, well, I hope you enjoy the video, so don't watch parts that are boring to you. To tee this up, let's discuss an analogy first. I want to use this analogy a lot throughout the process here because it helps define the business problem that Fatshark is facing with this product and that the players are having with the product all in one go. So it's actually really nice. It's a great analogy. So imagine, if you will, a restaurant. It's a restaurant that serves really good burgers. They have a bunch of signs out saying they serve fantastic burgers. Okay? You are a hungry customer. You want to go to this burger joint, and it's supposed to be like an upscale restaurant, so, you know, you're going to go there and maybe take your wife or your girlfriend or whatever, and you want to enjoy a little time with your special person and have a satisfying meal and maybe a couple of drinks, and you're going to do that tonight. And then, you know, if it's a good time, you're actually going to go there again. Perhaps it turns into your favorite restaurant, and so you're going to want to keep coming back to this restaurant on a regular basis. Maybe not every day, but perhaps every week, something like that, right? So that's the context for you as the consumer in this case. All right, let's look at this from the business perspective. The restaurant is interested in bringing you in the door because they're going to do that by offering you really delicious meals, right? They're going to offer you the key thing that you're looking for, which is food. But restaurants actually, in real life, make most of their money off of their drinks. So what they're trying to do actually is set up a really nice environment, you know, something hip and interesting, or, you know, something relaxing and attractive, whatever it is, to draw you in to stick around for a little bit so they can get some drinks in you. And the food is there to sort of lure you in so they can then sell you those beverages. And they don't even sell beverages to everyone. They make some small amount of money on food, but it's mostly about the beverages, right? So they're really trying to get those people in that want to buy lots of drinks. That's how a restaurant makes its money. Well, that's actually the same model as a live service product like Darktide. What Darktide is trying to do is get players in by luring them in with content. That's your burger. And they're trying to then sell them on a non-necessary but fun item like a cosmetic, which is going to be where they make their real money, and that's your drinks. Same exact business model. This is a restaurant business model transformed into the digital space, okay? All right, now I want you to hold that analogy in your mind. We're going to put it down for a second, and we're going to move over to product land, and we're going to start talking about the structure of Darktide in its current state, and start looking at some performance indicators, and decide whether or not Fatshark is meeting its own objectives with the product that it is offering. And we'll bring that analogy in wherever it's useful to help explain the situation that we're in. All right, let's talk about what our product is as part of the introduction to this sort of product analysis. Our product is a video game that is going to be sold as a discrete product as an entry fee. And then once you're playing the game, it's going to be a live service that you will purchase cosmetics to continue to fund. That's how we're going to make our money as the business. And then the player is enticed to be involved in the product by a number of factors. Most importantly, a really satisfying game. It's a fun game. There's content in the game that the player wants, so they're going to come to us to get it. We're going to ideally be the only ones on the market that offer that content, or at least the best on the market. And that's how we're going to entice the player to stick around and hopefully buy some of our cosmetics. To bring that analogy back for a second, that means we're the kind of restaurant that has a cover charge to enter. So we're going to need to provide a cover charge type experience. It's going to need to be really nice and polished on the inside. We're going to need to have a restaurant that has a really solid menu full of delicious items and excellent drinks, as well as anything else we might want. For example, excellent desserts. There's one other dimension to this. This kind of game service generally has a target market that includes a broader swath of people who are likely to only contribute a small amount to our bottom line of money making, but they are going to have some set of players that are going to create that we'll call whales in the traditional sense. They're going to create the majority of our revenue. Okay, so these are the people who are really coming in to buy cosmetics by the armful, and we'll do so over a long period of time as well. So we want to entice those people as well. So we need to keep them in mind when we're going into our next section, which is product goals and KPIs. All right, we're going to have to make some guesstimates here because I don't actually know what's inside Fatshark, but let's try to assume some goals that you might have if you were trying to do this with your game, right? So, okay, we are going to want to get as many players as possible to play our game, and we're going to want to keep them around, and we're going to get them buying cosmetics. That's obviously a goal. And we want to harpoon some whales. We know that because that'll, of course, impact our bottom line the best. So, these are all the goals we're looking for. All right, well, how would we measure this? All right, well, we want to look at how many players we actually onboard. Like, what's our player count? We're going to want to look at the retention of those players. And we're going to probably want to look at the player satisfaction there. And a couple ways we might measure both of those things is we might look at the number of hours a player is willing to invest in the game, the reviews and feedback we get, the capacity we have over time to maintain the players that we onboarded. We can, for example, go look at some Steam statistics to see how that's going. And we might want to look at the reviews of the game to see how satisfied our customers are or are not. And obviously, we're going to be very interested in the player inclination to purchase cosmetics. And we might do this by looking at how often the player checks the shop or how often the player actually makes a purchase of a cosmetic after some number of hours. These are all options we have to kind of investigate that. Lastly, but not lacking in any kind of criticality, we're going to want to identify the number of whales we've been able to poach as a consequence of our user base. And preferably, we're going to want to identify such things as like the proportion of whales we are able to gather relative to our population count. We might want to define what a whale is, and we might want to create any kind of profile we can of what kind of person this is that is whaling for our product, and what maybe kind of profiles we haven't identified, any kind of unknowns, as it were, that we might hunt for new whales for. And one thing we might look at is just a count of the players who purchased a large proportion of paid content relative to our average. So the original definition of something like this was around 20 times. That may not be the one that Fatshark is using or the one that we can use here, and I certainly have no data on this front, and I don't know where to get any, but at least we can define the problem we would be looking to solve if we were Fatshark, right? All right, so we've got the KPIs, which are our key performance indicators. We've got our goals. Basically, we have some measurements we can use to, from our own strategic perspective, from our own definitions, measure the success of the game. There are a few other common measurements we're going to want to use. So I'll just list those out real quick, and we can start diving in as we go. So we'll probably want to look at the market response. That'd be things like the sales volume, our portion of the market share that we were able to capture, and the customer reviews and ratings. We might want to do SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, to identify our strong points on the product, whatever weak points we have, any potential opportunities for growth or threats from competitors on the market, right? Because we're trying to make this a long-term supported product, not a short-term supported product. We don't just want to sell it once, we want to keep players coming back. So knowing what we might need to worry about is going to be important. One other area we might want to address is the customer feedback. We might want to do an analysis of customer feedback and see if there's any trends that we can address. Obviously, the game has released and it's been out for 6 months, so we should have a fair bit of feedback that we can utilize. So I'm going to be relying on a single source I was able to find for this, but Game Sensor says that there was about $60 million of sales with 2 million players onboarded into the game on the month of release. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad or not, since I'm not inside Fatshark, and I don't know what their costs, inflow, outflow calculation looks like. But my gut says that's pretty good. 2 million players is a decent return. And I believe, off of what I have for data from the Steam stats, that we looked at something on the order of 100,000 concurrent players at peak hours at any given day during the month of release. So let's see how we're doing now comparatively. Well, as you can see, unfortunately, we haven't done very well on the retention front. In fact, the average player count has hovered around 6,000 to 8,000 players concurrent at the same time. We could actually do a quick little calculation and see what percentage of the player base we've returned based on these two numbers from Steam stats. Now, assuming I still know how to do basic math, if we take 800,000 players as a rounded number and divide that by 108,000 players, we should get a decimal value we can multiply by 100 to get our percentage. So we should end up with about 7.4% of the player base remaining from the original batch, or a 92.5% decline. So if we take that real quick and work it into the previous set of numbers, we take that 2 million and multiply it by our 0.074 value, or our 7%. We end up with 148,000 players still playing the game of the original 2 million that purchased the product. Ouch, well that hurts. So what the heck happened? Well, this video is going to be about the current state of Darktide and how to get it to a better place and more players and all that stuff. But if you want to know what happened, we can actually just go to Cashcroft's review, Claysthetics review, Riken 14's, that's Riken XIV's review, or even Fleekazoid's original review of Darktide to kind of see what happened. The short version, at least, is they published the game, it was full of bugs, they fixed it up reasonably by December, but didn't include key finished product features like crafting through the month of December like they promised. They then went on vacation for a month, didn't say anything to anyone for a month and a half, and then didn't actually finish crafting until February 21st, despite their promise to complete it before the end of December. This obviously cratered the review score from a relatively positive position to a mostly negative one, and has been clawing its way up ever since. It's currently at mixed as of June 3rd, which I think is fairly accurate to the player perception of the product. The second to last KPI is inclination to cosmetics, and I don't really have an objective way to measure that one. It's also confounded by the fact that Fatshark has disabled cosmetics for the last majority of the runtime of this game, and so they only just turned it back on very recently. I don't really know what to say here other than the fact that I have seen some people in the news cosmetics, but not a lot, and the user base is relatively small, so who can say how much money they're making off of cosmetics right now? There are also confounding factors like players like myself, where I'm not buying any right now because I'm still kind of waiting, A, for something good to come out, and B, for any evidence that this game is going to address some of my biggest concerns. Once some of those concerns are addressed, I think this game is a shoo-in for success, so then I'm probably going to be more open with my wallet on this subject. The last KPI is the number of whales that we've been able to capture. Now, I don't have a way to capture this kind of data, but no doubt Fatshark does. We can apply a basic formula that's full of assumptions and not going to be very accurate. We could just take the player base and assume 5% of it is whales. That was kind of the original basis for how whales were defined for games as a service. So we'll do that real quick. If we take that 5% stat I was able to find on Wikipedia for how many players represent the whales of a population and work that into our 148,000 remaining players, that gives us 7.4 thousand players whaling for this product. I have no idea if that's good or bad, but we can presume that more is better, and we have a proportion we can use to at least guesstimate how many players would be whaling for this product if we had more players involved. So if you want to see revenue increase, one way we could do that, obviously, is to increase the total number of players, since that gives us better odds of capturing another whale. That's the largest impact, but it's not necessarily the only impact, so, we've got a little bit of an 80-20 rule going on here we might want to think about. Now, I'm going to really get into this in the conclusions and analysis section. There's a lot to say about whale-based models and how they're used, and they can be really negative and detrimental to a video game success if they are handled badly. I've said this before, but if you create a filter that too precisely filters in favor of whales and their personality types, or what you've analyzed to be their personality types, and you may be wrong about that, and then you are filtering out the actual player base, you can actually drive away your whales as well. And so you really need to be cautious here that you're not over-targeting and don't end up driving away your core player base, let alone your whale player base. And just to highlight this point, let's just go back to that analogy real quick. Unless you're deciding to turn your 5-star burger restaurant into a dive bar, you're probably not going to want to stop serving burgers. You're probably going to want to keep serving burgers, actually, and you're probably going to want to keep attracting the clientele that comes here for the burgers. You're not going to try to just only sell drinks. That's a dive bar. You didn't build a dive bar, so why are you trying to behave like one? We will get to what it all means in a little bit, but let's just do a little bit of market response analysis quick as well. So the sales volume, we already kind of know that's landing in the 2 to 4 million sold copies range. And we also now probably want to look at the market share. We've got some sense, but I did a little digging and I found Left 4 Dead 2, Vermintide 2, Payday 2, and Deep Rock Galactic were the titles that jumped to mind for me as competitors, right? There's 36,000 concurrent players in Left 4 Dead 2, 7 in VT2. Payday 2 has 20,000 and Deep Rock Galactic has 18,000. That totals 81,000 concurrent players not currently being captured by Darktide, who's sitting at around 7 to 8,000 concurrent players as well. That's actually near the peak. So most of the players that wanted a game like Darktide tried it and probably left. At least that's what I would guesstimate on the PC community thing, which means the most likely source of new players that haven't at least touched this game is going to be in the Xbox launch area, and other consoles if this goes to other consoles. I don't know how that's going to work out for Fatshark. Let's hit a quick SWOT analysis along the way through here. So based on my intimate knowledge of the product and a lot of discussion around the product and reviews of the product that I have read through as my source for this one, we have strengths: best in industry melee combat, great ranged combat, and movement system. We have a Warhammer 40k IP as a huge strength. We also have some of the best combat in any video game genre, and that's my opinion, but honestly this game really plays really well. Weaknesses: we have a more narrow niche market, which is co-op games. We have negative impressions caused by the botched release. We do have some of the worst supporting systems within PC games of its type. Actually, kind of in general, this is some bad stuff. We'll get to that later. A final big weakness for our product is actually a non-material one to the product itself. It is the poor communication we have around the product. We've done a poor job communicating with our player base, giving them a sense of our intentions, direction, and time scale. And we've continued to disappoint them, upset them, or ignore them at various times. So we might want to address that one. On to opportunities. We are lucky in that improvements to the game has actually seen review scores climb. So we can redeem this game if we continue to make improvements to it, which means that our community isn't completely lost and our customer base will actually come back if we make improvements. There is a huge expansive universe with plenty of content to mine, so if we mine the right content, we can attract players that way. And once it's ready, the Xbox/console crowd can experience a non-botched launch with all the features we've put into the PC version that have been climbing its popularity. So with any luck, we'll retain a lot larger portion of that initial launch to then sell cosmetics to. Finally, for threats, we do have negative reviews in press that we need to try and convert wherever possible. Improving the game is going to be the main way to do that, and then maybe letting people know that we've made those changes at some point with our press machine might help. Any new launches that are coming out that are in our genre are obviously a threat. Non-genre stuff might not be as big of a threat, but it still could be. But let's look at some of them. Payday 3 is on the horizon. That could be dangerous for us. And Redfall was a lucky break for us in that it died on launch, at least from the perspective of, Fatshark's luck. That was good, though. Sorry to those guys and that team for such a terrible result. The last threat I could think of was current games like Deep Rock Galactic or Payday 2 releasing new content that draws away players from our game, and that's certainly going to be a risk on an ongoing basis. But for the most part, as long as we continue to build a competitive product, I think we're going to be all right. There's one more section to talk about before we get into the conclusion and recommendations component of this whole exercise, and that's the complaint section. Now, I could spend basically forever in this section. There's a whole host, a litany of things really to discuss that are negative, that need to be addressed and could be addressed. But the purpose of these kinds of analysis is to hone in on the key things, the key details that people are focused in on. And since I'm deeply involved in all the conversations and discussions and reviews of this product, I can speak authoritatively about the things that players are generally most annoyed by, just through the milieu of constantly reading them and hearing them in-game and out of game. So I'm going to list off seven complaints that I think are the major complaints that are uniform across the player base, or at least relatively common in reviews and everything else, and we're going to then maybe talk about how they can be addressed. So complaint number 1, top of the list for sure for most players, is the crafting grind is preventing player agency in building different weapons and getting access to different weapons and builds for weapons through artificial locks and RNG gating. This is really painful for most of the player base. There's a whole campaign going on in various places to, quote, break the locks, and there needs to be some way of addressing this problem. Number 2, missions cannot be chosen, and mission difficulty modifiers cannot be chosen either. For many players, they've stopped complaining about which map they play, since they kind of all blend together a little bit after you've played them a million times, but being unable to choose the modifier of the difficulty is a real problem. There is low intensity and high intensity mission modifiers. Then there are modifiers to those intensity levels, one of which is called Shock Troop Gauntlet. Players really liked when this was introduced, especially players who wanted the challenge, so they're playing the hardest difficulty with what they consider the hardest mode, but they're not able to get access to it most of the time. And as a consequence, many of the players that I talk to and have read when talking about the game will describe a process whereby they actually do not boot the game until there is a mission of the difficulty choice that they want, thus completely avoiding all of the retention systems and all of the cosmetic systems of the product. A game that actively tries to make you not play it is a bad game. Item number 3 is class resource siloing, which grind gates the players from content far too severely. It's one thing to have to level up a new character and a new class each time one is created. It's an entirely another to not have any of the resources on one of your characters available on the other. This is things like crafting materials and money. The consequence of this is if you play one class for 100 hours, none of those resources are available to you on your other class, and so you have to start the entire grind all over again. The problem here is not merely that you have to do more grinding for new gear, but instead that it interacts with the game difficulty itself. This grind forces the player to play at a lower difficulty for a significant amount of time, just because you haven't invested the right amount of time in a new character. This feels bad because lower difficulties can actually be extremely boring to players who are used to higher difficulty. Even though your weapon and equipment level may not be up to the task of a higher difficulty, your play capability and your player skill is, and as such the game feels super boring when nothing is threatening you in the slightest. But if you do take your garbage low rolls to a high level game, you will have such a hard time killing anything that it is frustrating instead of fun, and your win rate may be lowered enough to make playing this way significantly inefficient for getting new gear. Either way, you end up locking the player out of content they might otherwise enjoy. This is a direct negative for Fatshark because players are finding their hurdle so high that they simply opt out of playing altogether, thus directly negatively impacting player retention. In fact, this means whole swaths of available content, which is to say things that Fatshark spent money and time on, are being dismissed out of hand, thus increasing the waste to profit ratio dramatically. This entire problem was already and originally solved by Vermintide having account-wide crafting mats and money, and in Warframe by having frames, classes essentially, be equipment that can be swapped out. Complaint number 4 is a lack of class variety. When this game launched, there was only 4 classes, and 6 months later, there is still only 4 classes. Originally, it was promised to have a new class every quarter. It's been 2 quarters with no new classes. That needs to be addressed immediately, but comparatively, this game had far fewer classes to Vermintide 2, which started with 15, and Vermintide 1 had 5, so we're really hurting for class variety here. Additionally, a lot of people were hoping for more interesting classes than what has been teased through leaks. There is a Gunlugger class for Ogren and some sort of Sergeant for the Veteran, and those 2 classes could be interesting, but I'm failing to see much more than derivative content for the Zealot second class and the Psyker second class. Players are a lot more interested in something like a Rattling Sniper, a Arbite, a Death Cult Assassin, or perhaps a Sister of Battle or Tech Priest, or any of the other content in the 40k universe that would fit this power level that we're currently playing at. This is something that should be looked at and addressed as well. Remember, variety is the spice of life, and going broad here in the 40k universe rather than deep on each class is probably a better idea thematically and from the player's enjoyment perspective. Different feels are going to be much more interesting than derivations of something that's already present. Number 5 is poor weapon balance and variety with high redundancy. Now, there are a lot of weapons in Darktide, but a lot of them are so bad and such carbon copies of other weapons that they're not really worth mentioning. Even when something like the Stubbers manage to be relatively interesting, there's usually still one that's the best and the other 2 are bad. The worst part, though, is actually that many of the 40k iconic weapons, such as chain weapons and power weapons, are often worse than the more basic medieval weapons like the axes. Currently, the best weapon in the game is a basic axe with no power effects at all. And one of the worst weapons in the game is actually the chainsword, which is a deep irony considering it's supposed to be a 40k game. Number 6 is poor social systems. There are a number of elements to this one, but I'm just going to address a couple that jump to mind. So there is the inability to stay with a squad after a mission. This was in the game and then removed due to bugs. I presume it will be brought back, but it should be a priority to do so. There's no real way to find squads or create friends after a mission. It's actually quite hard to do so. There's no way to sort of queue up a mission to go together with people within the game, and there's no real incentive to do so in the first place. So there's a lot of social systems that are fairly weak. Also, crossplay isn't enabled for the platforms that the Darktide is on, so probably should enable crossplay for this game in order to maximize the player base. The final complaint is one that's going to be a long-term problem to address. So the game was supposed to deliver a live service, and it instead was a broken game on launch. 6 months later, the live service part hasn't really shown up, except maybe if you consider the first 2 maps or so that were just released. Ultimately, there was an expectation set by Fatshark of multiple new classes being added regularly, new maps, and other types of content. The game's finally in a decent space, and so we may see that over the next 6 months naturally. And if that starts to happen and the pace of change is good, then I think you'll see reviews for this game rise and players return to the game because it'll finally reach the status that it was intending to achieve on launch. If that doesn't happen, then I think this game will continue to languish on trying to put itself together. There's one more major point I want to address in the feedback section. This isn't a complaint, but it is a uniform positive feedback, which is that the gameplay itself, the game part of the game, the burger, if you will, is really, really good. In fact, it's so standout that a lot of people, myself included, have played this game well in excess of that so-called 100 hours cap where you start to get annoyed. I am annoyed, but I can't help myself. I like playing this so damn much. The problem, of course, is that I'm more patient with bad systems than most people. I mean, I played Eternal Crusade for like 120 hours, and the only reason I really stopped was because I was tired of playing a Space Marine and wanted to go back to playing Eldar, but the population count had dropped so much that I couldn't anymore. Swooping Hawks were fun, man. There's one other piece of feedback that came to mind while editing this, and I'm going to add it in real quick. The cosmetics, especially the paid cosmetics, actually aren't very good for 2 classes, the Ogryn and the Zealot. They're just fine from what I've seen in the leaks for the Veteran, and what's coming out for the Psyker is pretty good. I've even used some of my Imperial Edition Aquillas to purchase Psyker cosmetics, but I've not bought anything for the Zealot, and I haven't bought anything for the Ogryn, and I think that's a shame, especially considering the Zealot is my favorite class. Take a look at some of the stuff that's in the lore. I mean, we have from the Necromunda game, the Cawdor, and the Cawdor Redemptionist. Look at these guys. These are awesome. Why don't we have these? I mean, seriously, Fatshark, if there's one thing you don't want to do, it's phone in on the classes and on the cosmetics. Universe has a ton of stuff, and if you farm it right, you're going to be making big money. And if you don't farm it right, you're just going to be wasting your time. Well, we've done our analysis. Now we have to ask the question, what does it all mean? Let's jump into conclusions.
Makes you wonder why we even bother shipping trash like that. Save a lot of data slate work just to process the execution notice now.
What do you say, criminal? Shall I put you out of your misery?
And ours, you would.
Be quiet.
This is a mistake. I am a loyal servant of the throne.
Shame you'll never get to prove that.
Phone of terror! We're boarded!
Catify now!
Well then, what conclusions can we actually draw about this product from our analysis? Well, the bad news is that this product launch was a total and complete catastrophe. We pretty much failed to meet every single one of our strategic objectives, and all of our KPI measurements except the original onboarding process count failure. And since onboarding led into terrible retention, we're probably not doing all that well right now. Still, despite all the negatives, we did identify a few upshots in our little bit of research here. We've discovered that we did actually impact most of the PC market that's interested in this kind of product, and so odds are high that we could recapture that interest if we could return this product around. And we have seen that continued improvements on the product have improved reviews, so it may be possible for us to engage a redemption arc here. We also know that if we release our improved product to the Xbox and console, once those reviews have improved, we probably have a better shot of retaining that new market that we haven't touched yet. So that's potentially a room for growth for this product that we haven't yet tapped in on. Speaking of redemption, we do actually have some idea of our strengths now. There are things that we did well enough that they're still carrying our game despite the total catastrophe of its launch. We did hit the strategic objective of having a really satisfying gameplay loop, so all we have to do is figure out how to get the systems and negatives out of the way that are holding us back. So, the ranged and melee combat is excellent, the gameplay is regarded highly by the player base that's still here, and we still have that Warhammer 40k IP. So, if we can manage to leverage those things and downplay the weaknesses, we actually have a fair shot of a redemption arc. We just gotta kinda get out of our own way. You know, Fatshark keeps calling the players rejects in all of their comms links and communications, but after they lost 92.5% of their player base for the biggest game launch in their history with one of the largest IPs in the market in gaming in under a month, well, maybe they were the real rejects all along. And just like the bare bones plot of Darktide, they're going to have to crawl their way up the ranks. Every time they do, someone will be there to tell them, actually, you still don't matter. Keep working hard and you might just prove yourself. It's a great irony to me that the story of Darktide is the story within Darktide itself. They start in a prison cell with mostly negative reviews, and they're just going to have to keep fighting until they can make it to something more in the middle range and maybe one day reach that Auric class. We'll see if they can pull it off. I'm certainly rooting for them. Now, I know we didn't have to go through all that analysis and tedious analogizing just to draw this most obvious of conclusions, but it does actually set us up quite nicely for the next part, which is recommendations. We've kind of covered a lot of ground, so we don't have to talk about everything all over again. We can just dive deeply into what matters. This is all part of the exercise in the first place. Summing it up, getting to the conclusion, then saying, hey, I have good ideas. Well, I think I do, so let's go look at some of them. Way back in January, while the Fatshark team was still on winter vacation, I took quite a bit of time to write out a big long list of all the changes, MVPs, and small adjustments that I would probably make if I were in charge of the product. I've been kind of tracking the product since then, and watching what they've been doing. They're operating at about half to a quarter the speed that I would have assumed one of my teams would have been able to manage. So, with that in mind, I'm going to be making recommendations and MVP suggestions to what I think their speed is actually capable of. Now, we do know that the situation is bad, and we do need a redemption arc, so I'm going to propose 3 strategic pillars that are going to enlighten and guide the rest of these recommendations. So the strategy here is going to be 1. Focus on what is good, replace or circumvent what is bad. 2. Deliver regular and rapid, meaningful content. 3. Favor speed and iteration over polish and preciousness. I'll try to make this quick, but let me just dwell on these pillars real briefly so I can actually explain what they mean. For number 1, we know the gameplay is good. Sure, there's some hiccups with balance or whatever, but for the most part, people like the product where they are actually playing it. We need to avoid building out any new systems or creating impediments to the gameplay itself. This is a good idea because the market and our players are being very clear with us on what is good and what isn't. Anytime we design a system or add a new system or tweak a system, the question needs to be, does this help the player get back into the game faster? Or does this help keep the player in the gameplay section more often? Every second we spend outside of the strong part of our game is exposure to the parts that we know the player doesn't like. So, wherever possible, let's try to avoid that. I want to reference recent news about Overwatch here, actually. Apparently, the whole time Overwatch was blowing up and becoming this massive phenomena, they were actually still funneling most of their work hours into a totally stymied MMO conversion project, a project that failed even as they pushed into Overwatch 2. They failed to ride their surprise success because they refused to change course when the opportunity appeared. There's an old writer's trope here. Kill your darlings. I've actually done it multiple times while editing this, and you better believe it harms your profits, Fatshark, if you don't. Lean into what works, don't chase failure forever. Number 2 is to deliver regular and rapid meaningful content. We need to deliver on the live service part of our product, and pronto. It doesn't need to be perfect. We know this because other successful products deliver imperfect but fun content all the time. It's actually a good way to retain players. Speaking of imperfect, it's time to give up the ghost on pretending we're some pristine development house full of polish and precision. For number 3, I said favor speed and duration over polish and preciousness. Fatshark's reputation is incredibly bad at this point anyway, so stop trying to pretend to be some consummate professional that you aren't. You make somewhat buggy, but really fun games. That's good enough. Stop trying to fix every bug just because it's there. Focus on adding things and only fixing the bugs that really matter. If dogs are good enough, they're good enough. Why did you ever bother with muties? They were basically fine. Just because a bug is in your backlog does not make it a priority. What matters is what is hurting your retention and killing the entertainment of playing the game. Some slop along the way is normal to a high-speed dev process. God knows I've allowed lots of bugs to languish because the workaround was easy and it wasn't really hurting anything. Hopefully that clarifies my strategy and why I think it's the right approach to getting that redemption arc going. Let's go into an ordered list of changes that I think are achievable and are in order of the priority or the difficulty level. As we go into this last section, I just want to say one thing about product work. While it is actually normally my job to get into the nitty-gritty of every product I work on and make specific decisions, including inventive whole system reworks, I'm not going to be doing that much of that here. I don't think it's appropriate since I don't have full information, and instead I'm going to be looking to make recommendations that are precise to the problem, but maybe not precise to the exact solution that we might want to undertake. Instead, I'll try to make strategic recommendations that would satisfy the player base enough to get the product moving in the right direction. So with that, let's jump into the first problem we need to solve, which is the crafting system. I've already addressed how bad crafting in Darktide is. It's basically a gacha type model, and that's terrible for the player base and for the game itself. This isn't a mobile game. It doesn't have mobile game load times. It doesn't have anything like mobile game style in and out gameplay. It's pretty much the opposite of a mobile game in every single way. It's more of a game you sit down to play for several hours. It's not the kind of thing you pull out of your pocket and drop right into the shop from. So a mobile model is a bad model, and I don't know why we're doing this in the video game industry, that we think it's a smart idea to try and copy a model for a system that is entirely different. It's not a good model, and stop doing it, really. Focus on what PC gaming is for. Hardcore, attentive users who are going to drive a lot of attention to the product for a long time. Focus on making a good experience over time so that the player keeps coming back. Left 4 Dead is a game that is still very well alive. In fact, it has more players concurrently every day than this game does. That's because that game focuses on the gameplay. Now, you could milk Left 4 Dead for more money by adding something like a cosmetic system without adding a gross crafting system that no one likes. Not only that, but unfortunately for Fatshark, they seem to have done the exact opposite, the literal inversion of what they said they were going to do. They wanted a non-randomized, non-repetitive action type crafting system, and instead that's exactly what they gave us. There's no meaningful choices, there's no strategy or goals behind the crafting system. It's ugly and awful. And it's doing the opposite of its intended purpose, which is to drive retention. Players are leaving because of the crafting system, not staying for it. So it needs to be revised. I'm going to make 2 recommendations here. One of them is short-term. The system simply needs to be ameliorated so the game can live long enough that we can hit that redemption arc. I would say break the locks. I don't think that's actually a perfect solution. There are good reasons why the locks exist, and one of them is to try and extend the grind time. That's not a terrible idea on its face, as much as everybody hates a bad grind for gear. Having a system in place that allows the player to always be striving for something better is cool. It's just implemented so poorly that it actually drives players away. So with that in mind, breaking the locks is a good solution in the short term. It's probably going to be a while before we can actually go and do a third rework of the crafting system. With that done, we've bought ourselves some time. We now have an opportunity, with an ameliorated crafting system that won't drive players away quite as hard, to spend some effort in reworking it a third time. I recommend we begin the rework and redesign process in year 2 with a target of delivering that revised system at the end of year 2. I know that's a tall order, and it's not going to be easy, but it's probably very worthwhile considering how badly our crafting system has been received. The goal should be to drive the player back into games as often as possible. That's where our strong suit is, so let's focus on getting the player out of crafting, out of a bunch of menus, and into the actual game as much as possible. In fact, if at all possible, there should be a way to get weapons inside the game itself as pickups. This would improve the gameplay loop because now the gameplay and acquisition are tied together. The strongest part of the game is the gameplay. I don't know exactly how you want to do that, but having them be found in back alleys or things like that could be good. A chest-based system could be fine. Special missions and quests that are done to specifically get key loot could be fine. Anything that makes the player play the game to get their gear rather than getting some stand-in for the gear with a fungible liquid asset like materials is probably better than what we're doing now. And no, the Emperor's Gifts don't feel good and don't make a good stand-in for this. It should be something like drops after you kill a big enemy, or a vault that you have to break into and fight your way through as a secondary objective in the mission to get the loot, and then the cost of doing so is risking failure on the total mission, which could cost you the entire loot haul. That could be a lot of fun and would be a way better way to do this. That's just a hypothesis of mine, and I'm not going to pretend to be the expert on crafting system design here, but that would be how I might approach some of the problems. Another thing I would do is I would go towards that crafting system design which included attachments. Attachments are actually a good idea, and they will extend the lifespan of your crafting system because they give you more things to look for. More parts to attach to your gun are literally more things to grind for. And yes, I know grinding is something that people don't like to some extent, but that's not entirely true. People like having something to work for, a reason to click the play button. It just shouldn't be painful to do, and that's what it is right now. So having an attachment system would not only be meaningful and strategic, but hunting for the parts that you're looking for to make the perfect las gun is actually ideal. Right now, the Lucius las has a Picatinny rail on the rear instead of a rear sight, and that's horrible to look through, and it's clearly begging for an attachment. Also, the nighttime mode doesn't work right because, it's dark, but nobody can have flashlights unless you run specific guns. That's terrible too, and only adds to the problems. One more item and one more idea that I want to add to the crafting discussion here is blessings. I think blessings are fine as a means of improving weapons. They're a little rough in their implementation, but let's leave that aside for a second. That can be cleaned up, and I'm sure Fatshark has some ideas. What I'm actually thinking about is how it would be interesting to have the blessings and the blessing level reflected on the weapon itself. Imagine, if you will, that as you upgrade your weapon, it looks cooler. And there's a really great way to do that in 40k lore. Purity seals. There are 2 blessings on every weapon, potentially, and you could add up to 2 purity seals to each weapon based on player preference and based on the upgrade level. Imagine, if you will, a purity seal that is, longer or more detailed for the level of blessing involved. Now you could arrange the placement of those purity seals on the weapon. You could potentially have different designs for purity seals that could be sold as cosmetics for the paid shop and for the non-paid shop. And you have a little bit more customization and also some level of interest on the weapons themselves that identify them as higher level weapons or lower level weapons to other players, which is useful information in the context of the game. I think this is a cool idea, and I thought it was worth bringing up, even though maybe it's not a fix to the crafting system itself. All right, let's just quick summarize the plan on crafting, and then we'll move on to the next section. Plan is an amelioration of the major problem with crafting rationale, which is the complete lack of deterministic customization of the systems via the removal of locks. We're going to follow that up with a rework of the crafting system starting in year 2, Q1, working our way towards a release at the end of Q4. All right, with that most painful issue resolved, we should continue to work on, and I understand that Fatshark is, the Xbox release. I know that the PC player base is going to want more stuff, and that's great, but we do need to continue to drive the Xbox release out the door. Now, I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that any content we make for the PC would go on an Xbox, and any changes that we fix, any problems that have been identified in PC that we fix, will make the Xbox release that much better. This is probably why Fatshark has said that they are still focusing on the PC release. They're probably trying to get it to a state where the player base has decided it's good, so they don't actually flub the Xbox release too. This is wise. Getting that conversion done in part-time and getting the fix done in part-time is probably what I would be doing, and is probably what Fatshark is doing. This isn't a bad idea, even if it's kind of boring for the rest of us to watch them sort of get stuff out a bit at a time. The only problem here, and a big watch item for sure, is that we need to be careful that we haven't taken all of our senior developers away from the PC product and moved it onto Xbox. It's really easy to do this by accident, and let me just remind people that engineers are not actually like cogs that are identical to one another that can be swapped around. Engineers have useful, specific knowledge about a product domain that they work in, and they oftentimes take a lot longer to get something done if they're moved around a lot, so it's best not to do that. Okay, but what else should they be working on while they're working on the Xbox stuff? The answer is classes, and they should be targeting to get one class out at a minimum before the end of the year. Ideally, they should push out 2, and those classes should be interesting. Ideally, in my view, the Gunlugger is a good one because you're looking at some new weapons at least that will be very fun, like the Heavy Bolter. The Heavy Stubber will become more usable, of course. The Plasma Cannon, Auto Cannon, any kind of heavy weapon that the Ogryn might be able to carry could be a lot of fun to use. Additionally, the Veteran Sergeant or NCO or Commissar class, whatever it proves to be in the end, looks good. I hope it has dual wielding. This game certainly needs it. It's basically iconic for 40k, so I hope they add it. But what I would say here is that will be fun because a more melee-focused veteran with maybe some support functionality could be a lot of fun for the player base and really change up the gameplay. The reason classes need to be targeted next and not something like maps is because classes are a more bang-for-your-buck kind of change. I know they might be a little harder from a dev perspective to make than a map, but from a player perspective, they're going to have a significantly higher return on replayability. A class changes your gameplay dramatically. Every map that you play a new class on is practically a new map because you have a completely new way to engage with it. Likewise, every enemy feels fresh as you try to figure out how the class handles those enemy types differently. It's a force multiplier for your actual game to include more classes. Let's pause here and talk business model for 1 second. Should Fatshark charge for classes or slots for characters who I presume will be unique on a per class basis? The answer to that needs to be no. However, Fatshark should charge for archetypes, and they should make more as a priority over making derivative classes. I said it before, and I'll say it again. Variety is the spice of life. There's a lot of material in the 40k universe. You can probably charge for new and interesting archetypes much better than you can charge for classes. And you'll get a happier player base, and business-wise, you'll be aligning the income of your business with what players definitely want. So someone like me will probably buy all the archetypes just to try them out. That's a great way to get me wailing for your product. There are a lot of people like me, and that shouldn't surprise you, because look at what kind of game this is. This is a 40k game, and who does it appeal to most? The target market's going to include mostly 40k fans. It's going to have some overlap with other types of co-op shooter games and stuff, but like the type of person who's here that wants 40k stuff is going to spend a lot of money on your 40k stuff, just like we did for all the plastic toy army men that we bought. Personally, I have like 15,000 Eldar and a large component of Tyranids and Imperial forces as well, so you better believe I'll shell out if the diversity of class types and archetypes is there. Another thing you might inspect is, depending on the stress being put on your resources right now, if you have half-finished classes, it might be worth releasing them in their half-finished state as long as they're functional. For example, maybe you've got only one of the feat bars done and the rest of the feat tree isn't complete, but the class otherwise works. I would consider releasing that as is and just have a coming soon on your thing. I know you'll probably get clowned on a little bit, but if you start working with the players more directly and say, listen, we want to provide you content at a faster pace, we're going to send stuff out when it's not quite done and give you access to it. That's going to look better if you start to set a nice reputation of rigorously sending content out. Considering how bad of a job Fatshark has already done on releasing their content in a highly polished state, just stop trying. Like, getting the stuff out in an iterative, quick-moving way that shows the player base you're interested in providing them the content is going to be way better received at this point. Your polish is a joke at this point. Every time you put out a patch, you have like a million bugs. Rather than trying to get everything perfect, which you're never going to do, try to get things out fast. Frankly, I would be perfectly happy with a class that only has 1 bar of feats at this point, because the gameplay impact for me would be really high without that extra 2 bars of feats. Half the classes in the game still have feats that are broken anyway, so most of the build customization that's there in the current 4 classes don't work anyway. And for that matter, stop fixing the dogs so much. Get them to a reasonable state and then stop. and revert the muties. The muties getting fixed was unnecessary. They were good enough and nobody was really complaining. So stop polishing when you should be adding to your product. There's one other crazy idea that jumped out at me while I was editing this, and I just can't kill it off like I have with a whole bunch of other stuff that wasn't that important. Right now, Fatshark is saying that their classes are supposed to have more depth than the one they put in Vermintide 2, but most of the players who play this game actually had the inverted complaint. The classes seemed like they were either at least the same or even had less depth. Plus, many of the classes have feat trees that are full of bugs or don't work, and a lot of the feats themselves feel like they were stripped out of the class's original design. I have a proposal for Fatshark that I think is worth looking at. Rather than trying to build a bunch of depth into each class and then do a bunch of derivative classes on that class, focus on going broad. This is a business strategy I proposed before, but hear me out. If you look at the veteran class, the sharpshooter, there's a number of feats that really strike me as belonging to the rattling sniper more than the veteran sharpshooter. I'm not saying we should gut the veteran sharpshooter at all, leave it alone at this point, but what I mean is, you could have had two classes where you have one, and they could have had each their own flavor, and therefore improved the game while doing really no much more work. I guess a little bit of voice recording, and I don't know how hard that actually is, but, fair enough. For example, the veteran has Demolition Stockpile, Unwavering Focus, and Counterfire. Those feats are very veteran-y to me. But the Ratling could have had Cover Fire, Deadshot, Camo Expert, and the bigger they are instead. Those could have been specific to the Rattling Sniper and given it the feel of someone running around in a camellia-lined cloak and sniping things. What I'm suggesting here is a change in pattern. Rather than trying to create such complex, highly detailed classes, create very simplified classes. Make your Death Cult Assassin, for example, or your Irebite, for example, or your Sister of Battle, for example, whether they're a class or an archetype in implementation, have a much more simplified tree. A single row, they're just a single playstyle, and the class itself is a playstyle. If you want to look to games that have done this, well, look at any hero shooter. There's only a few differences in each hero for the most part. They maybe modify the movement speed, they have a few differences in the character size, and then they usually have like a couple abilities. Warframe did the exact same thing. What's the difference between one Warframe and another Warframe's playstyle? It's centered on like a handful of abilities, actually, in most cases, which are then modified in size and scale by cards. But the difference in flavor is actually most dramatic on only a few differences. You could take advantage of this actually in practice by creating a whole bunch of broad different classes and archetypes, charging for the archetypes, not charging for the classes, and then aligning your player base's interests to the product to keep them around. There is an additional benefit to this approach, and I'm going to belabor it slightly. Every new class you add that is not derivative means new, unique cosmetics that a player like myself might buy. When I'm talking about going broad instead of going deep on these classes, I'm actually invoking another game's strategy here, which is the expansion strategy that we have in Total War, Warhammer 3, and 2, and 1. I've bought so many of those packs because I love to play all the different factions. This is the same idea, but it's just different classes. Fatshark should take advantage of that rather than chasing a business model that's highly derivative. I know derivative looks flashy on a spreadsheet because you're getting a lot of value per action, but I don't think it's actually that profitable in my guess. I think what you're actually doing is harming yourself by failing to take advantage of the variety that's there that a player is actually going to want to pay for. If I buy a cosmetic from my veteran that has a cybernetic eye, and that works on my zealot and my psyker just as well, then I actually am not getting any advantage. And neither is Fatshark. They made that one cosmetic and they sold it to me, but the fact that it goes on everybody and the fact that I bought it for one particular thing isn't to their advantage, it's to their disadvantage. Sure, I like that it can go on anybody, but it's not why I bought it in the first place. I wanted my veteran to have a cybernetic eye. And if I were to buy a Death Cult Assassin, I wouldn't put it on there, or I'd want a different one. Something that reflects more of an assassin-y feel, right? That's a cosmetics advantage to going broad over going deep. So take that as you will. Let's move on to the next section. Next up, we need to solve the mission difficulty selection issue. At this point, from what I'm hearing from the player base that plays this game a lot, being able to pick one mission over another doesn't matter that much. What actually matters is not having the challenge you want when you get into the mission. It's a lot more impactful to land in the same part of a map but have a totally different experience in that part of the map due to the enemy concentration, distribution, and type. So If I show up to some part of the map and I've not fought 7 Crushers there before, that's a brand new experience on that part of the map. That's a brand new map as far as my brain is concerned. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. In fact, the whole Left 4 Dead franchise thrived on that fundamental experience. New enemies, the same enemies even, but new enemy density experiences in different parts of the same map that you will run over and over again keeps the gameplay fresh for a really long time. So, how do we solve the mission difficulty selection issue? I propose something very simple, and we'll have to do 2 things. They're not that hard. 1, we create a new difficulty. The new difficulty will have just 1 spot on the board. It will be the same difficulty level as Damnation, but it will always be High Int Shock Troop Gauntlet. That's it. We can worry about maybe tweaking the difficulty 6 at some point to be more, but for now, just High Int Shock Troop Gauntlet will satisfy the player base, and have it always being there will always be a fun thing for them to go challenge themselves with. We can iterate on that later. Next item, we should go back to the Damnation difficulty, the level 5 difficulty, and make sure that there is never 2 low int modifiers at the same time. The difficulty level modifiers, since we have 3, should always be opposites of one another. There should be a low intensity whatever, and a high intensity whatever, and a normal. That is a perfectly reasonable way to do this, and I can't believe it's taken 5 however months to address this problem in this obvious manner. Make this a priority and knock it out this quarter. Alright, now we need to address underperforming weapons, especially iconic ones like the chain weapons. We should also give the power weapons a balance pass. I know this isn't new content, but it shouldn't take us that long either, since most of the stuff, I hope, is living in a JSON file somewhere for the product team to modify based on whatever the combat team says. Heck, maybe the combat team modifies it directly and we don't have to get the product managers involved. I don't know how you're organized. What I do know is that this can't possibly take that long. Be aggressive about it. And if you manage to screw it up badly and the community is really upset about it, go make a hotfix for it. You managed to get rid of the shirtless bug in like 3 days, so why can't you change a weapon in 3 days? I assume your system isn't so poorly architected that you can't change a weapon in 3 days. Let's address the final of the top 3 player complaints in this section. Now, we're not doing these in that order necessarily because part of product work is addressing things based on the ease of accomplishing them, not just on how important they are. So we're going to target what we think we can actually achieve in a reasonable timescale. So let's accept the technical difficulty here, but put it in a place where we can get it done before the end of the year on our roadmap. That's not unreasonable, I don't think. The resource siloing issue has to go. We know what to do, unsilo the resources. It's just a technical hurdle for us to achieve. We don't have to get that done before a new class or 2 is released. We just need to tell our player base that, hey, here's your new class. I hope you really enjoy playing it. We're working on the resource siloing issue and we're going to get done as quickly as we can. It's a technical hurdle for us, but I promise we're going to remove that barrier as soon as we are able to work it out. Alright, there is one other thing we should probably look at within my feedback zone, which is I think we need to look at mission and difficulty select from the perspective of a rework entirely in year 3. I think it's a bad system, but I think the proposals I've made would mostly ameliorate it for at least another year, probably. It's tolerable as long as I can get access to the difficulties I want with consistency. But it's not ideal, and I think we ought to be working towards an ideal mission and difficulty select system because such a system is centered and central to how much we get to enjoy the game we want to play, and the game is the best part of our system, so let's get rid of anything that's in our way here. That, to me, is a year 3 project, ending in Q4 again. We'll start working it out, figuring it out in year 3, Q1, and we'll work our way towards a solution, a plan for a solution by Q2. We'll start that project in Q2 and we'll get done by Q4. That would be how I would kind of structure this. It might go a little longer than that, but as long as we implement against what I suggested earlier, I think we're going to be okay from a player perspective. We may need to make changes based on feedback on the ground, but that's at least a good starting point for a plan. Now, I know there were other things in the feedback section, but most of those have self-evident solutions, and not being inside Fatshark, I'm not sure how I would prioritize those beyond what I've talked about here. I've kind of been looking at what could be reasonably done based on Fatshark's pace in the next 6 months to a year. I realize I set some multi-year targets here, but those are, on the back end of the plan, and those are that's sort of all green fields, whereas this stuff that I've suggested, this precise stuff I've suggested, is within the realm of this year or the middle of next year to be delivered on, to keep this product alive so that it has a chance at its redemption arc. The last thing I'll say about that redemption arc is they're going to need to communicate with their players a little better if they want to pull it off. One of the things to keep in mind about video game developers is, despite what some might think, they usually don't go into video game development out of greed. It is a big business these days, but it's not really that profitable either, and it's really hard to do relative to the rewards you get. Most of the people involved are into it for the passion of it, which is awesome, and I applaud that. That's why I'm pulling for Fatshark on this project, even though they've flubbed the ball so many times. No doubt one of the reasons why their communication is so poor is just because they're embarrassed. One of the best ways to probably tackle that communication problem is just to go for a more humble and open approach. Right now, Fatshark seems to be being very precious and cautious with their approach to communication, and that's not working for them any better than the more cagey approach they were using before. I would say just go with, hey, look, we're having problems with certain things here and there. These are the issues we're encountering. This is the stuff we want to bring you. We're excited to bring you. No, I can't give you a timeline. We're still working it out. We'll get to you as fast as we can. And the only thing they need to make sure of is that when they say, hey, I'm going to do XYZ, they actually do XYZ instead of BAB, which is what's been happening so far and a lot of their communications. And that might just be because they're timing things badly. I mean, if they could just say we're going to do XYZ, and then if BAB comes along because it was in the works already and they just didn't, they're just deploying stuff in line with their timeline, then just, I don't know, let us know that you've done that. That's not that bad of a thing to do, to say, hey, we had this already in the works and we were almost done. It was easier for us to get it out the door and then go tackle XYZ, but XYZ is still coming. Look at that. That's so simple to say to your client base, and your client base will actually understand that kind of normal human behavior. Maybe if one of the lizard men in suits up there in control of the organization needs a little hand with communication between us, you social mammals, you could just show them this section, and then they might understand a little better how to talk to other human beings. I know it's tough for lizard people with their cold blood and their lack of friendliness, but trust me, it's good for your business, and, there you go. All right, I know that was a bit winding, so let's sum up real quick the actual plan. We're going to, 1, ameliorate crafting. 2, add more classes. 1 by Q4 minimum, more is better. 3, bandage mission difficulty select. 4, do a balance pass on iconic weapons. 5, make resources account wide. All of this should be done by the end of Q4 in 2023. Then, starting year 2, we're going to look at a crafting rework, and mission difficulty select should be reviewed for a full rework in year 3. All right, well, I think that's the end. I know it took a while to get here, and if you are still here, I really appreciate you coming along for the ride. It's been a lot of fun to make, though it has taken a tremendous amount of time, and I've really enjoyed kind of the exercise of going through a product analysis of a product like Darktide and just seeing what kind of interesting things I figure out along the way, and then trying to turn those into salient recommendations. This is not how most people do reviews of products, and so I thought maybe it would be an interesting way to do it, since how often do you really get to look inside the way someone who's actually building a product analyzes that product? Now, it's not really my product in this case, but since I have that window, I thought maybe I could share it. With that, I will simply say thank you all so much for coming to visit. I really appreciated your company on this long little journey, and I hope you have a wonderful week, even month. Take care. Bye-bye.